Legal, political. The history of the tolerance of objectification is questionable. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 and the legal definition of obscenity of 1868, whether the tendency of the matter charged as obscenity is to deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences, were established to criminalise objectification following major developments in photography, 1851. As obscenity is not protected under the First Amendment of the US Constitution, objectification manufacturers sought to change the legal definition, first succeeding in 1957, making it relative to time-dependent, person-dependent, and ambient content-dependent standards, which as a consequence have never successfully been used to prevent the objectification of human beings. Legal protection of the misrepresentation of a human being will naturally result in the legal protection of the destruction of a human being that does not conform to this misrepresentation, of arbitrary developmental age, abortion, of probable genetic defection, or of undesired characteristics. Objectification and the tolerance of objectification is psychologically damaging. Objectification, the tolerance thereof, may result in an acceptance of the objectification of one's sex and the need to self-objectify, which can lead to negative body regard, body detachment, and body alienation, which may result in self-harm, depression, and high-risk behaviour. The standardisation of objectification makes it very difficult to conceive the reality of the situation. Involvement in objectification with another, at least in principle, may be used for temporary relief, to remove stress and pressure generated by pre-existing tolerance of objectification. In an objectification-tolerant society, one's involvement in objectification is not their fault, but that of the tolerance of objectification. Objectification within advertising is biased towards a particular sex, and is not yet tolerated for the other, leaving our stance on human rights, let alone any theory of sexual equality, in question. One's inclination to tolerate the objectification of their sex by members of their sex is dependent upon one's sex, to an extent. It may improve the appeal of an environment where social factors reduce its appeal below that of its natural state. Contradicts all primary education systems. It contradicts educating the importance of one's ability to observe over one's ability to be observed, physical. Tolerance of objectification reinforces some belief systems, e.g., where objectification may be viewed as inevitable. Some belief systems accept objectification, lack of subjective significance, as a correct description of human nature, e.g. absolute depravity, and so are reliant upon tolerance of objectification for support. Not everyone is taught to be selfish, which results in differences in management and propagation of objectification. Tolerance of objectification prevents people from feeling the need to educate differences and similarities in psychology between the sexes to young people. Tolerance of objectification in the media, apparent self-objectification, encourages the objectification of an entire sex through miseducation, as being a deterministic physical organism without subjective significance. Tolerance of objectification in the media, apparent self-objectification, removes the sense of purpose and therefore subjective significance of a sex. Upon reaching a critical mass, like any other social belief system, objectification propagates by the desire for obedience and conformity under social pressure. Objectification has always existed in Western society, despite its intolerance, and can be argued to have fulfilled an important or even inevitable role in the dealing of unmet human desire. The historic existence of objectification within society cannot, however, be argued as a basis for its tolerance. Legal protection of the misrepresentation of a human being will naturally result in the desire to conform to this misrepresentation, whether by the prevention of pregnancy, contraception, the shaving of one's body, or the lack of eating. Legal protection of the misrepresentation of the human being will result in increased susceptibility to physical assault because people are less likely to think, assuming they have ever been given the opportunity to even know about the physical consequences. Absolutes such as indiscretion, indecency, or obscenity are meaningless in a society that tolerates objectification. Words used to describe instances of objectification in a negative fashion may be given a different application, e.g. outrageous. The physical nature may be cursed, e.g. expletives. It creates a distorted view of morality where temptation may be seen as an encouragement to go against one's conditioning for self-objectification, e.g. eating over generous foods, the circumstances of which may be used to highlight the moral value of conformity to objectification, thereby providing comfort to the conditioned. As objectification is a relative concept based upon the intent to objectify oneself or allow oneself to be objectified, tolerance of one form of objectification will imply a reduction in the apparent objectification from the tolerator's perspective of anything more objectifying than that being tolerated, allowing, for example, the rise of seduction, fornication, manipulation, adultery, and perversion against another's will. As objectification is a relative concept based upon the intent to objectify oneself or allow oneself to be objectified, tolerance of one form of objectification may imply a reduction in the apparent objectification from the tolerator's perspective of anything less objectifying than that being tolerated, allowing, for example, arbitrary persons to control their temperature without going against another's subjective will. Apparent self-objectification may be resultant from people being in a high-temperature environment, wishing to expose themselves to maintain a level of comfort, but not wanting to appear ugly. Makes anything less objectifying than the greatest form of objectification more recently experienced seem loving, allowing for the formation of apparent self-objectification. Apparent self-objectification is incomparable to other forms of objectification, and so it may be tolerated. The tolerance of the objectification of a person to one degree may lead to a personal tolerance of their objectification to a greater degree. It lowers the distinction between childhood and adulthood, where activities which encourage the enjoyment of personifying, subjectifying reality around us, e.g. toys, are replaced with a need to maintain an external image, objectify, e.g. competitive clothing. It modifies social hierarchy. It increases the relative subjective worth of the relatively physically unattractive. It increases the relative physical worth of the relatively physically attractive. It decreases the relative subjective worth of the relatively physically attractive. It decreases the relative physical worth of the relatively physically unattractive. It encourages the relatively physically unattractive to care less about their bodies, e.g. obesity. The relatively physically unattractive are more likely to be involved in apparent self-objectification, as they are the most affected by the tolerance of objectification. The relatively physically unattractive are more likely to be involved in apparent self-objectification, as they are less capable of attracting a mate or experiencing a real relationship. It may arise when the natural burden of females' pregnancy is not matched by the natural burden of males, fighting hard labour. Objectification or the elimination of the female burden, thereby evening out this discrepancy. Tolerance of objectification can make people disrespect their past or heritage, or times when there was no tolerance of objectification. Tolerance of objectification can make people disrespectful of nature, abhorring natural disaster, genetic limitations including cancer, physical limitations such as susceptibility to disease, death, and even laughing at the threat posed by nature at times, regarding nature as without meaning, being merely functional or an end to itself. It encourages the perceived right to advanced medicine, leading to a proportionally less physically fit population, and population growth, leading to the perception of need for contraceptives, abortion, and work-family restructuring. It encourages sexual activity, leading to increased fertility rates and population growth, leading to the perception of a need for contraceptives, abortion, and work-family restructuring. Prevents freedom and concepts of abstinence being considered irrespective of the purpose. For example, as a way of life, or as an unconventional method not to have children. Tolerance of objectification may result in social laws which do not take into account the differences between the sexes in their susceptibility to self-objectification, experience of apparent self-objectification, therefore being unable to provide a fair or just assistance of government. For a female to submit to their natural desire, they must objectify themselves, whereas for a male to submit to their natural desire, they must objectify another, fight for or claim them. It increases the necessity for security systems and deterrent reward-based behavior control, monkey, cookie, and zap. It results in over-policing, where the importance of justice is replaced with the importance of obedience to a set of rules, to maintain order in an objectification-tolerant society. The degree of consequence for one's treatment as an object is dependent upon one's sex, for example leading to pregnancy for females, and so societies in the development of means to prevent objectification have naturally been biased to reflect this difference. With the introduction of tolerance of objectification, however, societies must become reliant upon themselves, responsible for the protection of their citizens, rather than the citizens being reliant upon themselves, responsible for their own protection, meaning the social construct becomes biased in its service of protection and prevention of integrated objectification. So long as objectification of a sex is tolerated by the opposite sex, there is no reason to believe the opposite sex need or deserve respect. Objectification may be tolerated because one has to objectify people, society, in order to analyse it, and this may therefore be seen as a hypocrisy. Yet objectify here is used in the greater sense, external, objective, and subjective reality inclusive.